president of Americans for Tax Reform. We're the group that asks all elected officials to make a written commitment to you, the voter, that they will oppose and vote against any tax increases. Our goal, of course, is to say the government's big enough. Let's figure out how not to raise taxes, but how to make it more efficient, more effective, how to get things done, how to make a list of things that may have made sense 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 20 years ago that are now actually destructive of human happiness and get in the way. A lot of the regulations, more than 400 regulations have been found in the healthcare industry to get in the way of helping fight this virus. And Congress and state legislators have suspended those destructive regulations, but we've been paying for them for decades, generations over the years. So I'm joined today by two experts to talk about New York and the horror stories that you've heard that the governor of New York is taxing or wants to tax people who go to New York and volunteer to help with the fighting the virus. So all of the taxpayers are piling a bunch of money into the state. The governor wants us to pay for his unfunded pension liabilities and all this bad spending, problematic spending that he did in the past. And now he wants to tax people the Good Samaritan tax. Doug Kellogg, could you explain to us how this happened? Is this true? Is this real, or is this an internet thing? Although I read it in Forbes magazine. So what's going on, and why is New York in such financial difficulties that they're looking for pennies between the cushions of the sofa?
Yep. Thanks, Grover. Great to be with everyone today. It's absolutely true. And it's quite outrageous when you consider that the governor in his now famous press conferences has made quite the display of pleading with healthcare workers from across the country to come and help New York, and has cited various examples of people from around the country assisting the state, and gotten some public relations points out of it. And then the second it is convenient and politically advantageous for him, he starts using these people as his hostages, threatening to tax them, to tax people who are going there essentially as volunteers. They may be collecting some money in their home state from their old job, but their work in New York is just emergency volunteer work. And he's threatening to sic New York tax authorities on them to collect income tax and potentially go after money that they're earning in their home states even. So
this is
very aggressive.
Income tax he wants to collect from them, or sales tax?
He wants to, so he needs to clarify, I think, exactly everything he might want to collect. But at least from what he said, he opened the door to collecting income tax based on their time in New York. But these could be people who are in a situation where they're essentially not earning money from the work they're doing in New York. So they'd be getting taxed on income from their home state job while they were volunteering in New York, which I think is pretty offensive, especially in light of him pleading for them to come and assist the state. And I think it's important that our viewers know how aggressive New York tax authorities are. They may already have some idea, but for any of these workers, and these are rank and file kinds of healthcare workers, if they don't comply quickly, they will have a tax authority that conducts about 3,000 non-residency audits a year. They've collected $1 billion from these efforts over 7 years, up to the latest numbers we have ending in 2017. And they'll go after your cell phone records. They'll dig through your social media feeds. My favorite absurd example is they'll go look at veterinary and dental records in their efforts to verify residency. So, it really is gross for the governor to be attacking volunteers like that.
So he has raised about $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion a year from people who've left New York and say, I'm living in Florida. But then he puts on spies and says, we see you go to a dentist in New York, so I say you really live in New York. Is that the argument?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And even if Fifi goes to the vet in New York, that can be used as evidence against them. And obviously it's stressful and costly to deal with that kind of an aggressive tax authority.
I've talked to individuals who've left states and moved to Florida or Texas that were told by their lawyers, you must stop giving any money to local charities in New York or Connecticut or New Jersey, because let's say, like your alma mater, right? If you went to state school in New York and you keep giving because it was your alma mater, even though you're living in Tampa, Florida, they say, see, that's a connection. So their argument is no more charitable aid to anybody in New York if you want to prove you're not in New York. And instead of going to visit a doctor when you're visiting New York, which is perfectly legal to do as somebody from Florida, you must tell the doctor that you've worked with in the past, I can't work with you anymore, or they'll tax my entire income in Florida. So people, I presume you can do this once to you. After that, you learn the rules and you never again do any business with people in New York if you can avoid it. And your dentist and your doctor and your everything, your hairdresser are all going to be in some other state, like the one you live in.
You would assume so, but individuals, I'm sure somebody out there could push their luck. I'll have to remind Syracuse of this next time they call me and ask for a donation.
Yes, that's right. I'd love to help you, but I don't want to pay New York taxes. For heaven's sakes. So how much money does he think he can make off of volunteers?
I haven't seen a number on that. And I think that sort of gets to the larger point here, in that the governor is really looking for a larger sum of money than what he would get from taxing what is a relatively small number of people, right? He wants Congress to give the state more money. In fact, he's sort of concocted a $61 billion figure, claiming that that's the deficit the state will face. And they need that amount of money from Congress, probably to try to set a high number and the largest demand off the top. Everyone should be aware that that is 4 years worth of predicted deficits for the state. That's not a short-term emergency figure. The state faced somewhere around a $10 billion deficit going into this budget cycle. And in the midst of the coronavirus exploding in New York City and the state, the legislature went ahead and passed a budget that was essentially what was planned before the virus exploded. So they have not made significant sacrifices yet. They're starting to look at a hiring freeze, but it certainly seems like
starting to think about it.
Taxpayers to bail them out first.
Just starting to think about a hiring freeze.
Correct.
Small businesses and large businesses across America have been firing people for months, but the government hasn't even thought maybe they should stop hiring people.
They've sent a letter to agencies in the state saying to start looking at finding savings. So it's a very urgently worded letter. I haven't seen up to the point I'm aware of before we started any concrete news on what kind of cuts will be pursued. Again, they made some adjustments in state Medicaid, but that's an area where they had to find savings going into this. And the state has also really caused their own problems there by making Medicaid costs go up, particularly with dumb policies like a $15 minimum wage increase, which added over $800 million in costs for taxpayers directly into Medicaid. So they already had issues going on. Maybe some of the savings related to coronavirus, but they already had to deal with that either way.
Wow. Katie McAuliffe, how does one stop this cross-border kidnapping of taxpayers and going through their boots and pockets to see how much money they have? Is there something that Congress can do? Is there something that other states can do to stop New York or other loser states that are in such bad financial shape that they've turned highwayman against their neighbors?
Yeah, issue has been going on for a long time. In fact, if you remember back to Hurricane Sandy, New York did the same thing to emergency workers during that time period. So when folks came in to deal with telecommunications issues, getting power lines turned back on, arborists, EMTs, doctors, pretty much everyone who came into New York, they were dealing with major complications with New York wanting to charge income tax. And that also creates a huge paperwork burden on those individuals. and also on the companies who are trying to figure out how to file tax, because right now every state has a different length of time that you can be in that state before that state starts charging you taxes on your income. So when you're looking at that, some states have an agreement with each other, like DC, Maryland, Virginia. There's a pretty clear agreement as to who gets to charge income tax, especially since we have a lot of cross-border living and working. But in the northeastern states, that's not really the case, and it's been a major problem. So folks who maybe telework from Connecticut or go into New York one day, folks who go in regularly for business meetings or something like that, but the bulk of their work is in Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, somewhere nearby. Those folks face those tax threats too, because there aren't agreements between the states. So that's been an issue for a long time, and Congress since 2006 has had the Mobile Workforce Act that's been brought up a couple of times, and actually it's been brought up every session since 2006. And what the Mobile Workforce Act would do is establish that you have up to 30 days before a state can start going after your income taxes.
Now, what do they do with baseball players and rock stars who come through town, football players? If you play in a New York stadium, do they want 1/12 of your income because you played 12 games, or is it by day?
It's by day. So unfortunately, the Mobile Workforce Act wouldn't help those folks out either. Pretty much every state takes a cut of income for those folks, depending on where they are performing, playing, whatever they're doing. There is an exception for that hasn't been written out of mobile workforce. So that's still an issue there.
Okay. How many people get hit with this? We're hearing about this because Cuomo seems to be kind of churlish. People go to help him. They take 2 weeks off from work. They're getting paid because it's paid leave. It's their vacation. But they'd be paid if they sat on the beach. So they're volunteering in New York. And yet he wants to take a cut of their pay.
Which is really awful. And, I don't know what the full number is. Maybe Doug has an idea of how many people are going into New York volunteering right now. But this has been happening, again, with all disasters and primarily in, as you said, loser states. And we know that these states do go after people once they leave or when they've been there just for a short period of time. Like, for example, California has an IRS, or a State Department of Tax, in Illinois. So we know they're looking for people to get after any kind of taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. I mean, you name it, they are going after it.
There was a gentleman who won a Supreme Court case because California sent police spies into Nevada to try and see what his house looked like. And their argument was that he had invented something and built it, made, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars. And California wanted to argue that he'd thought of it when he was in California with a high income tax, and produced it when he'd moved to Nevada, where they have no income tax. And so they're playing these mind games and trying to, go after him for. Eventually, the Supreme Court slapped California down for sending agents with no authority into other states and harassing people.
And that's a major case. And that's a really big deal. I mean, they harassed him for 10 years or more? I mean, the court process is a really long, drawn out process. And most of us don't have the ability to take states on these long, protracted legal battles.
Okay. So what else can be done? Can Florida protect its residents against New York? Does it take federal law? Does it take a lawsuit? How do we fix this cross-border theft?
I think it really takes a federal law, and mobile workforce would definitely do that. It would provide certainty for people who are being good Samaritans during times of need. It would provide protection to them. It would provide certainty for businesses who are allowing their workers that time, or businesses who go into those places for a certain amount of time to work on emergency issues. Mobile workforce would definitely set that boundary at 30 days, which is actually pretty common throughout the states. There are just a few of them that say 1 day. And those are, of course, the loser states like New York.
Okay, what are the other problematic states?
Doug, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, I think that there are a lot of usual suspects. you start thinking about that. So California, Grover just mentioned an anecdote there, very aggressive. New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois. In fact, Katie was highlighting a problem with the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, which may become more serious because everybody's been forced to stay at home. Some of their sort of truces about how taxes are collected for people who commute into New York City from New Jersey or Connecticut, obviously separate states. There's a lack of clarity there now. Could these states start fighting over their income since they've all been stuck at home? And what is the line there? I mean, it may be good. It may be defend them well enough that they are forced to stay at home, but that's something that could be certainly debated. How much are they being forced to stay at home? And then what happens there if these states start fighting and having to defend income tax revenue from people who work in the city? That would be a wild situation on top of what we're already seeing, and also highlight the need for these reforms.
Now, there may be another piece of legislation before the next election that's supposed to spend more money on states. Might it be possible to get a federal law that says in an emergency, anyone who volunteers or even works in an affected state, it does not end up being taxed for that? I mean, if the federal government brings people into New York to rebuild after Sandy, the storm, why in the world should New York tax those people? They're there not because some jobs there. They're there because the federal government came in to help New York. There may be some way in legislation dealing with emergencies to say, at least in emergencies, there should be no limit to how people can stay tax-free if they move into a state to help.
Right, that's really common sense legislation to say that that's for an emergency. Mobile workforce would be for any amount of time, but it could be amended to be just for emergencies, perhaps part of if there is another COVID package, that could be something that was put in there to help these folks out, kind of a good Samaritan version. I would prefer to see the Mobile Workforce Act in its entirety the way that it is passed, so that we don't have to deal with emergency declarations, deciding whether the federal government decides it's an emergency, the state government decides it's an emergency, kind of all of those complexities. And it would also help people out a whole lot just in the regular course of business.
Now, the mobile workforce legislation, has it been voted on in the House or the Senate? Do we have a list of co-sponsors? Is this something that could pass tomorrow, or is it a long way off in terms of not having the votes yet?
So it's been introduced for, like I said, since 2006. And it has been a bill that's been discussed regularly. It was voted out of committee in the House. It has passed various times, but never made it all the way through. So right now, the Mobile Workforce State Income Tax Simplification Act is both in the House and Senate. In the Senate, it's introduced by Senators John Thune and Sherrod Brown. And in the House, Representatives Steve Chabot and Hank Johnson. And all of these folks have been sponsoring these bills for a long time. The House bill regularly has 15 bipartisan co-sponsors, and the Senate bill is popular as well. Not entirely sure why it doesn't get through, but it could have to do with some of our Democratic leadership coming from states like California and New York.
Okay, well, that would have some effect on it, unfortunately, yes. Well, maybe we can get something passed as an emergency legislation to give people an example of doing that. As we're coming up to summarize anything that we've not gotten to that people should be aware of, yes, it's true that the governor of New York wants to tax people who volunteer to help in New York during this crisis. They may be getting paid. They may be on paid vacation leave from their home state, and they want, instead of you donating your time to New York, in their view, you should donate your time and 10% of your income while you're there.
Certainly. Well, I can add some not so fun facts about Governor Cuomo's management here, especially for anybody who's joined late. spending has gone up 33% under his watch. So he's been driving the budget upwards while also claiming inaccurately that he's kept spending increases to under 2% a year. To add to his fiscal mismanagement, the state attorney general during Cuomo's tenures filed suits against banks that have returned $12 billion to the state. And despite $12 billion that essentially fell out of the sky into the state budget, they're still in this significant deficit situation. And they squandered that money on these economic development award shows, which I'd encourage anybody to look up. They don't believe they're true, but sort of awarding regional economic development grants to the states, to the counties and regions of the state, passing around this money they've taken from banks. And in the process of all of this spending and the governor's Buffalo Billion projects and all this stuff, Governor Cuomo triggered federal investigations that resulted in convictions for bid rigging for his top aide and childhood friend, Joe Percoco, and his top economic development czar, a guy named Elaine Caliero. So their names are not so much as important as just to highlight the level of corruption that does exist in the state. The governor has avoided direct prosecution on this, but it's not just the amount of money, but it's some very inappropriate ways that this has been spent and managed that should really be offensive to any out-of-state taxpayers hearing Governor Cuomo ask for their hard-earned money during this situation.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, just wrap it up with a couple of things. We talked about the Mobile Workforce Act, which protects individuals' income taxes. There are a couple of other bills that would help with these cross-border issues. One of those is the Business Activity Tax Simplification Act. And that one would set clear boundaries as to a state's authority to tax individuals, businesses, and products. So that would be very helpful there. And then the Digital Goods and Services Tax Fairness Act would also set boundaries for states' ability to tax digital goods and services. We've had a lot of issue with taxation of digital items like cloud, also advertising. California, even at one point, threatened to tax emails. That was a real thing. So this whole suite of bills, the Mobile Workforce Act, the Business Activity Tax Simplification Act, the Digital Goods and Services Tax Fairness Act, all have been reintroduced in the House and the Senate. Those would all be very helpful for solving a lot of these issues.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. And at Americans for Tax Reform, our website is atr.org. We follow all of these issues about federal, state, and local taxes, and sometimes how some states or cities try and reach outside their boundaries. And you may not think it matters how New York taxes its citizens, but they may decide that for tax purposes on Tuesday or some week, or when your train rides through New York City, you are in fact a would-be taxpayer of New York. We're certainly fighting at Americans for Tax Reform to keep their hands inside the railing and not mess with people who travel through New York or California or New Jersey, and allow states to raise money from people who live in those states and vote in those states, and not people who simply pass through. Thank you very much. Doug and Katie, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us, and look forward to seeing you again. Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform.